reconnect with the Book of Allah, which is something that people should be doing throughout the year, but many of us fail to do so. And the Quran is, in essence, the nourishment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided this ummah. So I wanted to look at a few text messages that relate to this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. So in Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed for you, in other words, made obligatory for you, just as it was prescribed on the peoples before you, in order that you might learn taqwa. لعلكم تتقون. The very first command in the Quran is to attaqu rabbakum, to have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And taqwa is one of the central and foundational meanings of our faith. It's a difficult word to translate, but it's related to protection, wiqaya, and the idea is that one wards off harm. In fact, the word in Arabic for believer, mu'min, means to actually make oneself safe. So iman is amana, means to make safe, and billahi, through God, to make one safe through God. Because if you're with God, then nothing can harm you, and anything that harms you is from God and by God, and because of the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, in essence, taqwa is warding off harm. It's entering into a silm. Udkhulu fi silmi kafa. It's entering into a surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah has given us a free will, but He wants us with that will to give up our will to align with His will. And this is the paradox of faith. And this is why the disbeliever is somebody who wants to assert his own will. And while we do have will and we do things in life, we choose things, Allah has given us all these choices, but He's also given us hudud. And so willfully entering into a surrender, a submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to enter into this deen. And that, in essence, is the way of warding off the consequences of being in a state of disobedience. So the month of fasting is a month in which Allah gives us ample opportunity to really align ourselves with this idea of being in a state of taqwa, because taqwa is to guard yourself from all those things that are harmful to you. So you have 5 degrees according to our scholars. Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi mentions them in his tafsir, the 5 degrees of taqwa. The first one is just taqwa al-kufr, to really guard oneself against kufr. And this is why every believer is a muttaqi who enters into Islam. Even if he's disobedient in his Islam, he still has taqwa of kufr. And so in that way he's a muttaqi, and which is very important, because hudan lil muttaqin, the Quran is guidance for the people of taqwa. And so just being a believer means you're a muttaqi, because you have taqwa of shirk, but then of kufr and shirk. But then you have taqwa of kaba'ir, just being concerned about guarding oneself against major wrongs. And then you have taqwa saghair, guarding oneself against the lesser wrongs. And then taqwa of mubahat, being concerned about too much luxury in life, just having too much of the mubahat, because it's all going to be a reckoning on the Day of Judgment. And even though it's permissible, if you're paying your zakat and doing all these things, nonetheless, being extravagant is not something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, la yuhib al-musrifin. He doesn't love the extravagant ones. And He calls the mubadhirin, the extravagant ones, ikhwan al-shayateen, the brothers of the demons. So Ramadan is this extraordinary opportunity for us to return to the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why Allah reminds us again in Al-Baqarah, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. This is the month that the Quran itself was revealed, according to our tradition. هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان. guidance for humanity and clarifications of that guidance. Wal-Furqan, and a criterion. It gives you a criterion by which you judge. فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْهُ. So whoever sees the moon, meaning whoever either sees it or has strong evidence that it's been sighted, then let them fast it. And so the fasting is an obligation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what's really important in this month is to reconnect with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, إِنَّ الْقُلُوبَ تَصْدَأُ كَمَا يَصْدَأُ الْحَدِيدُ إِذَا أَصَابَهُ الْمَاءُ. The hearts oxidize just as iron oxidizes when it is subject to water. قِيلَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ وَمَا جِلَاؤُهَا. How do we polish that rust? قَالَ كَثْرَةُ ذِكْرَ الْمَوْتِ وَتِلَاوَةِ الْقُرْآنِ. By remembering death and by reciting the Quran. So remembrance of death is one of the spiritual practices of a believer. Is to, in fact, really we should be remembering it in every prayer. So at least 5 times a day. One of the things that some of the Salaf said was, when they would enter into their prayer, Sallu salat al-muwaddi', pray as if it's your last prayer. So going into the prayer with the idea that it's your last prayer, when you say goodbye to your family, not assuming that you're going to see them at the end of the day when you come home, or you may not come home. So just living life with this sense of just that life itself is something precarious and that we could lose it at any time. And so remembering much of death. So remembering death, doing this reflection on death and on just the fact that life is temporal and that we're only here for a short time. In fact, the Quran, when it talks about the days of Ramadan, it uses what's known as jam'u qillah, which is the plural of paucity, ayyam al-ma'dudat, a few days. So this idea of Ramadan, the beginning of Ramadan is like the beginning of one's life, and the end of Ramadan is a metaphor for the end of life. And then the Eid is the afterlife, when we feast on the efforts that we did here. So it's just important to keep that in mind, that